Welcome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar session. We are presenting, is your organization prepared to secure payment data with PCI 4.0? And this is the service within our risk and compliance team. Now, just to provide a brief background, I'm Janice Parson, a VP within our project consulting services team. And I currently lead thought leadership as well as service development within our finance and accounting and risk team within our PCS practice. And my focus is really around emerging issues that come up. I'm also the ESG consulting services leader. Now, RGP is a global consulting company that serves over 2,100 clients globally, which includes over 3/4 of the Fortune 100. RGP enables rapid business outcomes by bringing together the right people who together create transformative change. Now, I'd like to transition over to our speakers here today.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Bertram, and I have been with RGP for 13 years now, and I am leading the PCI and SOC practice, and I'm happy to be presenting today.
Good morning, I'm Erica Forland, and I also am in the PCI practice for RGP. I've been with RGP approximately 13, maybe closer to 14 years, and I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about PCI DSS 4.0 this morning.
Great, thank you both, Jacqueline and Erica, and I look forward to both of you speaking and diving deeper into today's session today. So what we want to do first is we want to provide an introduction about payment card industry, the PCI requirements ecosystem, just a little bit, and then also there's also significant changes coming up with the PCI standards, and so both Jacqueline and Erica will really dive deeper into that, give you some highlights, and then also share in terms of how you can be prepared, as well as possible next steps to consider. Now, before we do that, I think we have our first polling question. So if we can push that out, the first polling question, just so that we have an understanding in terms of the audience or the attendees, how familiar are you with the payment card industry standards and the new requirements released? Are you very familiar with the PCI standards and have reviewed the new requirements? Are you very familiar but have not reviewed the new requirements? You're somewhat familiar with the PCI standards through indirect exposure or responsibility, or you're not familiar, this is a new topic, but you're very interested in learning about that. Okay. So we have quite a bit of the audience here, not familiar, this is a new topic, but you have interest to learn more, so about 40%. And then about over 30% somewhat familiar. So I think maybe the intro and the ecosystem would be very helpful just to set the background, and then we'll dive further into the standards. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. So, we want to be able to provide first an introduction about payment cards and the risk around that, especially around security breaches. So for us to sufficiently introduce payment card industry data, the Data Security Standard 4.0 or PCI DSS 4.0, we'd like to be able to first highlight the risk associated with payment cards and provide an introduction to PCI. So why do criminals want to steal personal information, and more specifically, payment card information? Now, according to a Forbes article, a single consumer's stolen credit card information can be able to be sold for around $5 to $150, depending on the amount of supplemental data included. And I like to also highlight 3 significant breach examples that occurred, just to provide a little bit more further context. Now, with Equifax, this was breached in 2017 that impacted 147 million individuals. It was significant because it included the names, birth dates, social security numbers, driver's license, credit card numbers, and other documentations that were exposed. So it was not just credit cards, but and even though it was 2017, it was probably one of the biggest ones that we wanted to at least share with you. And then also with Warner Music Group, this is a breach in 2020 where the payment card information was exposed over a 2-month period across multiple systems, so connecting to its products and services. Now, this was a big issue because a hacker can extract significant record data per second, but this is for throughout 2 months. And the third one with Dickey's Barbecue Pit, similar to Warner, this was a breach that occurred between 2019 and 2020, exposing 156 locations that contained approximately 3 million customer credit card information. So a lot of risk around payment card information. Now I want to just provide a little bit more background about the standard itself. And so what makes sense is to first provide background around PCI. So before diving into the standard itself, I want to just give some background around the organization that established the standard. The PCI Security Standards Council, or PCI SSC, is a global forum that brings together payment industry stakeholders to develop and drive adoption of data security standards and resources for safe payments worldwide. The forum includes representatives of founding members such as Amex, Discover, MasterCard, and Visa, who are also executive committee members and board advisors from technology, retail, banking, and more. And the council's mission is to enhance the global payment data security by developing the standards and supporting services that drive education, awareness, and effective implementation by stakeholders. And so for the PCI security standards, these are developed specifically to protect payment account data throughout the payment lifecycle and to be able to enable technology solutions that devalue the data and remove the incentive for criminals to steal it. And these are widely accepted and required standards expected by banks and payment card companies in order for an entity to store and process or transmit cardholder data. So the applicable parties, these are standards for merchants, for service providers, for financial institutions on security practices and technologies and processes, and also standards for developers and vendors for creating secure payment products and solutions as well. So that is just a brief introduction. Now what I want to do is transition over to Jacqueline and Erica for them to be able to explain a little bit more about how the PCI requirements apply to different parties and really dive deeper into the full ecosystem.
So thank you, Janice. The PCI ecosystem encompasses the entities, processes, and technologies that store, process, or transmit cardholder data, or that could impact the security of the cardholder data environment, or CDE, as we call it. This includes merchants, processors and acquirers, issuers, and service providers. The foundation of the payment ecosystem is the PCI DSS, or the PCI Data Security Standard, which is a baseline set of 12 technical and operational security requirements designed to protect payment account data. PCI DSS and payment processing are supported also by validated payment products, each with their own set of standards.
Great. So for the next polling question, what we wanted to be able to ask you is if you are aware of the payment card industry standards and the new requirements, and also, are you aware of the effective date to comply? So, yes, I'm aware of the effective date. No, I'm not aware of the effective date. Or you're not familiar with PCI. This is a new topic for me. So, I'm anticipating that likely from the first question that we will still get a large group that's just having to learn this. But I am curious in terms of the audience as well, just seeing who is aware of the effective dates here. So we'll give it a little bit of time. Give everybody a chance to respond and see. Okay. So we have a pretty close, percentage in terms of audience members here learning about PCI, but then also there's a significant number of folks here, over 40%, that are not aware of the effective date. So I think this would be a good time for us to talk through and go through the timelines of the effective dates, and that is one of our next topic areas. So let me change the next slide here.
Thank you, Janice. And that last polling question is really a good segue into what we have presented in front of you. What we wanted to do was to present to you the implementation timeline for PCI DSS version 4.0. The main takeaways for this slide is that version 3.2.1 retires in March of 2024, specifically on March 31st of 2024. And there's a subset of requirements that go into effect on that same date. And then the other part is that the remaining new requirements go into effect in March of 2025, specifically on March 31st of 2025. So we have two dates that we're marching to and that you should be aware of. And that's what you'll have here for your reference. Next slide, please. Thank you. With every 4.0, version 4.0, there are 13 new requirements that go into effect immediately, starting March 31st, 2024. Of these 13, 11 relate to defining and documenting roles and responsibilities. One relates to use of a targeted risk analysis process and a customized approach to meet a requirement. And the other requirement requires organizations to document and maintain their organization's PCI scope. So on that note, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the customized approach and the targeted risk analysis concepts that are being introduced in version 4.0. The customized approach focuses on the objective of a requirement and allows entities to goals to meet a requirement's stated customized approach objective in a way that does not strictly follow the defined requirement. The customized approach can be used in instances where the DSS states this approach is allowed and there are no business constraints or technical limitations. So typically speaking, when you're using the customized approach, you're not going to have any of the compensating controls that you've implemented with this approach. The targeted risk analysis is used to explain how your organization assessed the risks associated with a requirement and how you determine that the customized control your organization implemented meets the objective of a specific requirement. And please note that not all requirements in version 4.0 allow for the use of a customized approach. So you'll want to kind of take a note and pay attention to that as you're going through and reviewing the requirements in the new version of the data security standard. And as I mentioned before, if you're using a compensating control or you've implemented a compensating control as it relates to a specific requirement for a specific environment, you may not be able to use the customized approach. Next slide, please.
Okay, so on the previous slide, it showed 9 blocks with section headings. We tackled we tackle the next 51 new requirements that will take effect in March 2025 through these 9 areas. We've divided them into these 9 sections so that it'll be easier to kind of, figure everything out. So let's dive into them now. Under access review, we have control 7.2.4 to review user accounts and related privileges. So previously, there's been kind of an implicit requirement that you would review at least your privileged access accounts. With this new requirement, entities will need to include all user accounts and their associated privileges to ensure the rule of least privilege is upheld. In requirement 8.3.6, password lengths will increase from 7 to 12 characters. Entities can consider adding increased complexity by requiring the use of special characters and upper and lowercase characters, in addition to the minimum standards outlined by this requirement. In addition, this additional complexity increases the time required for offline brute force attacks if hashed passwords and passphrases. Another option for increasing the resistance of passwords to guessing attacks is by comparing proposed passwords to a bad password list and having users provide new passwords for any passwords found on the list. Also, 8.5.1 is multi-factor authentication will be required for all access to the CDE. In addition to the multi-factor authentication requirement for access to the CDE, there are a few more things that should be implemented according to the standard for the MFA. It must not be susceptible to replay attacks. So having that second factor that is a one-time passcode sent to an out-of-band device like a mobile phone or through session tokens will help prevent replay attacks. It will not be bypassed by any users, including administrative users. At least 2 different types of authentication factors are used. So for example, not just a 2-step process where the username and password is entered twice. It needs to have a code sent to a mobile device, for instance, along with the password, the username and password. And the success of all authentication factors is required before access is granted. And conversely, if one of those factors is unsuccessful, the message to the user will not be presented until all the factors have been entered. For every system where MFA is in place in combination with the minimum password length of 12, allows the entity to consider decreasing the frequency of password changes from the current standard of 90 days to a more suitable frequency, for example, once per year. So that's a benefit. However, a targeted risk analysis will also need to be performed in this case to ensure the risk is minimal and acceptable. So let's go to the next slide, please. There are a few requirements relating to reviewing and maintaining inventories on this slide. So these include 4.2.1 for trusted keys and certificates, 12.3.3 for transmission protocols and cipher suites, and 6.3.3 bespoke and custom software. Again, some new terminology relating to application development and requirement 6 are introduced with this new 4.0 standard. So in this case, bespoke software is software developed for an entity by a third party and per the entity's specifications. Custom software, on the other hand, is that which is developed by the entity for its own use. One last point on maintaining inventories, they will need to be reviewed regularly, and we would recommend quarterly to ensure that they are current, they're supported, and they continue to reflect secure configurations. In 11.3.1, internal vulnerability scanning will need to be performed through authenticated scanning. A few points to keep in mind for this requirement include making sure sufficient privileges are assigned to the accounts performing scans on each system. This making sure that the accounts used for scanning will not be used for interactive login, because if interactive login for these accounts is permitted, it will need to be managed in accordance with 8.2.2. And requirement 8.2.2 has a handful of sub-requirements designed to maintain accountability and traceability of the account. And in order to, reduce the effort required to remain compliant, you may want to steer away from these, utilizing interactive logging accounts for authenticated scanning. Authenticated scanning provides greater insight into the entity's vulnerability landscape. It will detect vulnerabilities that unauthenticated scannings will not detect. Therefore, you're going to need to plan for more frequent scans, or at least initially, time for remediation. One last point is to make sure that you're unable to accept for those systems unable to accept credentials for scanning are documented. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide addresses the need to detect and protect personnel from phishing attacks through technical controls in requirement 5.4.1 and through security awareness training in requirement 12.6.3. There is a new requirement for incident response, and that is 12.10.7. Incident response should be initiated and should have procedures that will be triggered when credit card data or PAN data is discovered. This seems easy enough, but let's go back to requirement that Erica talked about a few slides back, and that is 12.5.2, where entities will be required to document the PCI scope and confirm it annually. If you dig into the guidance on 12.5.2, it states that during this process, you will identify all locations of credit card data inside and outside the CDE. They also state that a discovery tool or methodology can be used to facilitate identifying all sources and locations of credit cards or PAN data, and to look at PAN that resides on systems and networks outside the currently defined CDE, or in unexpected places within the defined CDE. In other words, if you find PAN data through this process, the incident response procedure should be initiated. And therefore, if you run into this case, you'll also need to collect some information for the incident report. It needs to be documented. Some of these items include where is the PAN data located? Why was it missed previously? Was it found inside or outside the card holder data environment or CDE? Was sensitive authentication data also stored? And what is the current data flow process related to this PAN data? And finally, documenting how gaps were remediated through this process. Okay, I think we have another polling question now. Janice?
Great. Thanks, Jacqueline. So our next polling question here is, what role does your business play in the PCI security ecosystem? Is your organization a merchant? Is your organization an acquirer? Is your organization a service provider? Is your organization an assessor? Other, or you're not sure? And then just also note, from an assessor perspective, our GP is an assessor and have played that in that role. Right, Jacqueline? I just want to make sure of confirming
we are
appropriate. Yes. And so I just wanted to clarify in terms of, some of these roles that we are an assessor. And this is just so that we understand, in terms of from the process of touching a payment card information, either from a receiving, collection, storing perspective, just having an understanding what role your organization plays. We'll give it a little bit. Okay, great. So we have a number of participants here, about a quarter, that represent from a merchant perspective. We have about 16% service provider, no acquirers, and then a percentage as an assessor, and that might also be some of our team members here represented as well, meaning participants. Okay, this looks good. All right, and then I'll continue on for Jacqueline and Erica to go through further requirements.
Well, thank you for that last polling question, Janice. We're now at the section where, based off that polling question, we're going to talk specifically about service providers and some changes to the requirements specific to those service providers. There's a couple of the requirements on this slide that I'd like to call to your attention. I'd like to start with requirement 11.4.7. And this is one where multi-tenant service providers will be required to support customer requests to conduct penetration testing or for penetration testing results. In the current DSS, the level of support has been left to the discretion of the service provider. However, starting March of 2025, and again, that's March 31st of 2025, that support will be required. With requirement 12.5.2.1, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with regards to merchants, but for service providers, you must document and confirm your PCI scope every 6 months and after any significant change to the in-scope environment. And again, with merchants, and according to requirement 12.5.2, the requirement is for the entity to perform this every 12 months. So you'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference there for service providers. And then lastly, we have some of the A1 requirements listed here. The key takeaways for the A1 requirements is that some of the former requirements in version 3.2.1 were updated in version 4.0 to provide more clarity. And you're going to see that quite a bit as you're going through the new DSS. Next slide, please. So here we'd like to talk a little bit about risk assessment. One of the best practices that the PCI Council recommends for implementing and maintaining the data security standard as a part of your business as usual processes is reviewing changes that could introduce security risks to the PCI environment and using a risk assessment to determine the potential impact to your organization's PCI scope. Here, we outline a few requirements that are related to incorporating a risk assessment into your business as usual activities and using the targeted risk analysis we discussed earlier in the presentation. For some of the requirements that are frequency-based, your organization can use the targeted risk analysis to determine the optimum period or frequency the controls need to operate under in order to meet a specific requirement. Key inputs to the targeted risk analysis includes complexity of your environment, technological advances used to enforce adherence to specific requirements, and risks associated with both. The targeted risk analysis will typically be used where the requirement allows flexibility, such as requirements where there is a frequency or defined period, or in the case where the customized approach we've discussed is used to meet the objective of a specific requirement. Next slide, please. So here you'll see that there are additional requirements where the targeted risk analysis is incorporated. I'll leave these for you to review at your discretion. Next slide, please. So here, the POI devices or the point of interaction devices, the requirements that you see here are not new. However, we wanted to point out that with the new DSS version 4.0, there are some requirements that were moved from one sub-requirement in version 3.2.1 to a subsequent requirement in version 4.0. And again, you'll find as you go through version 4.0 that there are several instances where the requirements were combined or moved to different sections of the DSS, or they were updated to provide more clarity around the requirement and what your entity needs to do to meet those requirements. Next slide, please.
Okay, great. So we have our next polling question, and what we want to be able to understand is how does your company interact with the PCI compliance requirements? So the options we have here are we have an internal security assessor, ISA, who handles most of the work. Some of our team is trained on PCI requirements. We outsource everything to a QSA firm, or we have yet to reach the PCI compliance. So just more so in terms of where you're at within your organization, we'd be curious to hear and see from the audience perspective where you're currently at, or how you handle the PCI compliance requirements. So we'll give it just a little bit of time so that allow people to be able to answer that question. And it does happen. It's not so some organizations may want to handle some of this in-house. Some may want to outsource that to a QSA firm or company, and we are a QSA. So let's see. It's about 14%. We have an internal security assessor who handles most of the work, and then about over 40% with some of the team members trained on PCI requirements. A 13% outsourcing, and then over a third have yet to reach the PCI compliance. Okay, great. Thank you for answering that. I'm going to advance to the next section. Now we want to talk about being prepared and the next steps for you to get there to meet the new requirements. Excuse me.
Thank you, Janice. Okay, so the PCI Security Standards Council has outlined 8 steps to help entities get prepared for 4.0. So let's go through some of these. Start now. March 31st, 2024 is fast approaching. Stay strong. Don't let your version 3.2.1 control slip as you work on version 4. And this is probably the key takeaway from this slide, understanding the requirements. So today we touched on some of the new requirements and some of the new terminology. There's a lot more. For example, some of the requirements have been moved to other areas as to the standard, as Erica had pointed out, and a lot of them have been rewritten for clarity or merged with other requirements. This is going to take some time to sort out. So go through the summary of changes and the DSS to see the ways that the new standard will affect your organization. So let's go to the next slide. All right. Key takeaways on this slide will be use trusted partners, work with your QSA or ISA, and by now the entire QSA community has completed the 4.0 training. Just like our team will probably be attending the annual PCI conference in September to continue honing our skills. So next item is doing your own assessments. Test the controls before the formal assessment. You may do this internally or by engaging your QSA to perform a gap analysis. And lastly, I want to point out that you want to prioritize security as a continuous process. Build security as a business as usual practice. And over time, security will be ingrained into the organizational culture. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Yes, and before we go to the next slide, I just want to make sure we re-emphasize in terms of performing the gap assessment, because that is also very important so that you know where your current situation is. You really want to be able to get a grasp and hold of where you're currently at so that you are able to address that with the appropriate time frame. That is very important, and I just want to make sure the audience it's the key point to emphasize on and make sure that that you really spent the appropriate time to address that. So before moving on to the next slide. And also just want to make sure that because we do need to meet to the 50-minute timeline for CPE, and making sure that we have time to cover in terms of some of the Q&A at the end. I just want to make sure also from the speaker perspective that you're aware that we need to address and meet the 50-minute timeline. Okay, move to the next slide.
All right, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this slide. PCI Council has posted a lot of information to help you in your journey to PCI DSS 4.0 compliance. We referenced some of these documents today. For instance, PCI DSS for version 4 with expanded guidance is listed in here. The second last one. The summary of changes document provides a really good overview of the changes between the two versions. And so you'll see that listed fourth on this list. Also, if you go to the PCI securitystandards.org website, there is a great FAQ section, and it has a great search engine. It's a great resource for you to answer a lot of the common questions that come up. And the council has been adding to this FAQ since 2006 when the PCI standards first were published. And so there is a deep knowledge base that you can pull from. And lastly, PCI Perspectives blog, which is actually the last item, the last link on this page. It's been primarily focused on version 4 over the past couple of years, and it will be a really good resource for you. It will list all of the different areas that we talked about here on this slide and have links for everything. And I think that is it for now. So I'm going to hand it off to Erica.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Yes, and actually, oh, sorry. And Eric and Jacqueline, before we do that, would it also make sense to kind of run over the timeline again, just because we went through that pretty quickly? And I wonder if it helps for the audience to kind of emphasize that, and then I can present that from a timeline perspective, and then we'll go into next steps. How does that sound?
Sure, sounds great.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, let's do that.
Okay, so Janice, do you want to bring that slide back up again, please? And thank you for that. So yes, we do want to make sure that everyone understands that the timeline in order to be compliant or to prepare for your DSS 4.0 version assessment is very quickly approaching. March 31st is the cutoff date for the version 3.2.1. And 31 March 2024 is when you absolutely have to be assessing to the new version of 4.0. And as we've talked about in the presentation, not all of the requirements go into effect on that date. So you'll want to work with your internal security assessor and your QSA firm to go through those requirements and make sure that you're identifying what of those requirements specifically apply to your organization, and making sure that you're prepared for meeting those requirements in your new assessment. One of the additional things that's changing with version 4.0 is how the remediation is handled. And I believe that Jacqueline touched on that. So it's handled very differently than it was from version 3.2.1. So the more preparation you can do up front before that date, the better off your organization will be. And I'll go further to say that maybe just don't really focus on just the 13 that are coming due March 31st, 2024. I would also start looking at the other 50 plus requirements that are coming due March 2025, because the more time you give yourself to discover where your gaps are and to evaluate your environment and assess whether or not you're ready for the new requirements, the better off your organization will be. And again, I would work with my internal security assessor or who my QSA firm is with trying to make sure that the organization is prepared.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Erica, in that, with so many of those requirements, it's not just where if you identify the gap, you just flip a switch and then it's resolved, right? A lot of times it takes time to address the gaps, see if from a technology perspective, if that's even possible, or if it's more of a policy perspective, which then perhaps might be a little easier, but it can vary depending on the type of requirement, right?
Absolutely. And that's where we start talking about the customized approach, or perhaps the compensating controls. Because if you have a legacy environment, there may be some requirements where you're going to have compensating controls to meet the spirit of the requirement. Whereas if you're a company where you tend to lean more towards bleeding edge technology, you may be meeting the requirement via another method, not necessarily what's specifically defined within the requirement itself. So you definitely want to plan for that. And basically with version 4.0, it's going to be more documentation heavy. So where you're using the customized approach, where you're using the compensating controls, those are going to be documented. Where you're using the targeted risk analysis, that's going to be documented, in addition to your roles and responsibilities and documenting your PCI scope.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to transition over to next steps. So if you give me a minute. All right, back to you.
Thank you, Janice. And as Jacqueline went through in the previous slides, the PCI Council has put out some sort of guidance, steps or key takeaways that you can use to start your preparation. And really the biggest point is starting now to give yourself enough time to be able to work through that. For those of you who may not be familiar, and as Janice has pointed out earlier in the presentation, we are a QSA company and we do provide PCI assessments. We do PCI gap analysis and penetration testing services. And some of the things that we are doing with our clients right now is going through the 4.0 new requirements and talking to our clients about that, and actually helping them with identifying which requirements may be more specific to their environment, so that it gives them a little sense of direction on where to focus their efforts, or where they should spend more of their time in preparation. If you're interested in learning more about those types of services and the resources that we can provide to you, feel free to reach out and contact us. Our email addresses are there below. If you have an internal security assessor, definitely spend some time working with that person, because your internal security assessor is going to be very familiar with the PCI DSS. They're also going to also be looking at the changes that are coming with version 4.0 and how they specifically apply to your organization. And with that, Jacqueline, did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to add for next steps?
No, not at this point. I think you covered everything great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm sure this is, just this change is keeping you busy and perhaps up at night, having to think about how to be addressing this in the upcoming future. I do want to also just, before, I do have some questions I wanted to ask and inquire with both of you, but before we do that, I also just want to highlight, which I thought was great, was that, we have resources available that be able to help support you as well. And so, Erica and Jacqueline, would you be able to just highlight briefly in terms of the gap assessment and the RACI template and the targeted risk analysis form that's mentioned here, just a brief introduction or brief sentence, just so that the audience here knows what these items are? I think that'd be great too.
Yeah, we do have templates that we have been providing to all of our clients as needed. And for instance, the RACI template is a list of the PCI requirements or activities that you would perform in a typical environment. We customize those for our clients. And normally what we do is we meet with our clients quarterly as a complimentary service. For that, for every assessment. And the RACI chart is a really good resource. Everyone has, that we've gotten really positive feedback on that. And we have the template available for anybody that would like to have that. We're offering this to our participants. You just have to contact us and we'll provide that to you. But also the targeted risk analysis form is the form that we put together that addresses all of the council recommendations and all of the PCI requirements related to that risk analysis form. And included in that would be, say for instance, if you were going to find, for instance, credit card data in your environment. We also have templates for the risk or the incident response procedure and form that would be required if you found credit card data. So we've got several forms and templates that we can offer you if you're interested.
That's great. That I think clients or attendees would want to definitely take advantage of that. So that's great, Jacqueline, for sharing some of that background. So if you have interest in having some additional resources from that perspective, definitely reach out to Jacqueline and Erica and inquire about that, because it would be able to at least help you in your initial steps in your process. So, okay. So with that, Jacqueline and Erica, I wanted to just ask some last questions before we close out this session. And one of the questions, especially, was more around the timeline perspective, and that's why, wanted to kind of re-show the implementation timelines here. But I think it's also a really an important question for the audience to understand. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is that if your company started the assessment prior to the deadline of March 31 on the PCI DSS version 3.2.1, but you couldn't finish by March 31. This is in 2024. Now, if you couldn't finish by March 31, 2024, what happens then? What do you do if you're not able to finish that that you started in the prior version? Would someone be able to answer that?
Yes, Janice, and thank you for that question. I'll take this. And I'd like to address it from a couple of different angles. First and foremost, you can, as an organization, assess to version 4.0 now if you feel that you are in a position where you can do that. You don't necessarily have to wait till March 31st, 2024 to do your assessments under the new data security standard. But the bottom line would be that you want to have a conversation with your QSA firm and discuss where you are readiness. So if you've started your assessment prior to the March 31st, 2024 timeline, but started it on version 3.2.1, you should still be able to complete your assessment under version 3.2.1. You wouldn't necessarily have to switch over, but I think part of that's going to depend on the timing or the exact timing of when you decided to start your assessment. If you start your assessment in the month of March, it may be better to assess to version 4.0, but of course the requirement is that March 31st, 2024, version 4.0. So what I would encourage you to do is to work very closely with your QSA firm as far as what version you're going to assess to if you're starting your assessment before March, and they should be able to guide you through that.
Great. Thanks for answering that. And I think because I had a second question is, if you start in March, if you start your assessment in March 2024, which version should you be assessing to? And I think you might have already suggested that, but I just want to make sure we share that with the audience again.
Yes, Janice. And, like I said, if you're starting your assessment in March of 2024, we would recommend that you start assessing to version 4.0. But again, you would want to have a conversation with your QSA firm just to confirm what the plan is and how you're going to be assessed going forward. Your QSA firm will be able to give you some guidance on that as far as whether or not you should start on 4.0 or not, but it really is going to depend on the timing and that conversation that you have. But also, again, if you wait until March 31st, you absolutely will need to assess to version 4.0.
Great.
Jacqueline, did you have any additional thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree that it's going to be a conversation between you and your QSA to really figure out when you want to, what your intentions are in starting that, the assessment. So, yeah.
Okay. Yep. No, I thank you for sharing that. And I think that would be very helpful for the audience. So another question I have is that, so with this new version of PCI DSS, how is the remediation handled going forward?
I thought
I heard that earlier too. So
yeah,
okay,
I'll take this question. So for version 3.2.1, it's always been understood that the PCI assessment is a point in time, and so QSAs will generally allow, they will always allow remediation to occur as long as you are compliant at the point in time of the report date. With 4.0, the council wants us to focus and encourage security as a continuous process. So remediation will still be permitted as before, and the result, will still be a compliant report. But what you'll also receive from your QSA, in addition to the report on compliance and the attestation of compliance, the ROC and the AOC, is a new form called the items noted for improvement. So you'll see this if you go out to the PCI website, you'll see that it's called an INFI report. This document will outline the areas where gaps were noted and remediation and remediated during the assessment. So this will be an internal only document. So you're not going to be sharing this with your acquirer. Everything will still be the same. You'll just receive an extra report.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Jacqueline. And just so that people are aware that remediation is not going to be handled the same going forward with the new standard. So with that, I think it would be good to hear from both of you. What would be the biggest takeaway that from this change that you would want the attendees to go away with, and just be able to recap from today's session?
All right, I'll start. Start now if you haven't already. And really, the sooner you understand how the requirements are going to be affecting your environment, the better off you'll be. So it's great to have the plan. It's great to start now, and everything will be fine after you you figure it out. Start now and don't panic.
And to kind of add on to what Jacqueline was saying there, I would say another key takeaway from everything that we've talked about today would be your partnership with your QSA firm. Work with your QSA firm to help you prepare for your 4.0 assessment, because they're going to have a better, likely they're going to have a better understanding of the requirements. They will have studied up on those, as well as you may have some internal people who may have studied up. but there should be some dialogue that's taking place between you and your QSA firm going into your 4.0 assessment, so that you don't get into your assessment and then you find surprises. So that would be what I would say as a key takeaway.
Well, great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your information and just your knowledge about the new standards that's coming up. So I want to thank the audience. If you have any questions, and specifically on the resources, please definitely reach out to Jacqueline and Erica. You will receive these slides likely within a week of the session. So this information will be available to you, the slide information. But that wraps up and concludes our webinar session today. Appreciate your attendance, and thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.